Hi, I'm Dr. Junius Johnson, and I get a lot of questions about grammar. I'm a Latinist and an former English major, do a lot of work with literature and with the classical tradition, and one of the things that people ask me about a lot is grammar, because grammar is one of those areas of our educational system where certainly my generation older than mine, we didn't get a lot of very good instruction in this area. But it's not just that we didn't get the level of instruction we might have liked. They didn't teach us enough. It's also true that there are some aspects of what was being taught that really aren't consistent with a classical understanding of what is involved in grammar and the work that grammar does in language. So I wanted to take a few minutes in this video to talk through what some of those things are, to just kind of describe the nature of grammar, what's included, what's not included, and what that means for how we assess how we think and how we write. So first and foremost, grammar is made up of two primary categories. It's made up of syntax and it's made up of morphology. These are both Greek words that declare exactly what they are, but since most of us don't speak Greek anymore, it's not exactly clear what they are. So let me break it down for you a second. Morphology, from morphe logos, the study of form, is the rules that govern how words show their functions through their forms. So for example, if I say cats, the word cats indicates to us that it's plural by means of the S added to the end. That's a morphological truth of the English language. So if you can think of it this way, morphology deals with what's going on inside of the word, right? Internal to the word, how is it changing itself so that it can communicate to you, hey, this is the kind of work that I'm doing, or this is something that's important about me in this sentence. Syntax then consists of all of the relationships that hold between the words. It's how words come together to make meaning. So for example, if I were to say, by whom were you attacked? The reason I say by whom and not by who is that whom, morphologically, is the object form of the pronoun who. Right? Who is the subject, whom is the object. So that's a morphological truth about whom. But the fact that I want an object case at all, rather than a subject case, that's determined by something outside of the word whom. That's determined by the preposition. The object of the preposition should be in the object case, and so it's a syntax reality that says, give me the object case of your word. It's a morphology reality that the correct object case of who is whom. So you see how those two things work together to generate structure. And that's a really, what I just said there is a really helpful way to think about it. What grammar does is grammar generates the structures that define a language. That's not all that's involved in language, mind you, but those structures are important because we work with those structures to create meaning. So there's a whole other group of things that are not actually part of grammar, but that are important aspects of language. And again, this is classically speaking, I'm thinking about this from the standpoint of the long tradition of thinking about languages like English, but also like Latin, German, Greek, that sort of a thing. There are some movements in linguistics these days to rethink this a little bit and to sort of categorize things a bit differently. But my horizon here is, how do we understand English in a way that is consonant with how it has been understood by the great English thinkers and writers of the past? So for that, we're going to stick with the traditional understanding, traditional account of linguistics. And here are some areas that I think are outside of grammar proper. The first one, and this might be a little surprising, is pronunciation. How you say a word, where you put the emphasis in your word. That's not a grammatical thing primarily. Grammar generates the structures, as I said a moment ago, but it's phonology, how we speak and put these sounds together, that realizes the structures that grammar makes. So pronunciation, there's room for pronunciation differences within an individual language, and a lot of that stuff happens at the dialectical level and at the level of subdialects and even idiolects, where you might have someone who pronounces a word a funny way and it sounds funny to the rest of us, but we all know exactly what they mean. That's acceptable. Right? Another area, and this is one that I think there's a great deal of misunderstanding about, is orthography. That is to say, what's the right way, ortho, to write, graphe, this language? Orthography includes spelling and punctuation, right? So how you spell a word is something that is not a grammatical truth about the language. It's quite accidental. It's one of the last things, it's usually the last thing, spelling and punctuation, to develop in a language. And the reason is quite simple. Because languages, natural languages, develop in communication between human beings. It's not the case that a group of humans, a tribe or a nation, sits down and says, "Well, we're a people now, so I reckon we got to have our own language. So let's hash this thing out and see what we're gonna do." And then they get out the pens and the paper and everyone starts writing stuff down and they compare notes, and ultimately through a process of committee work and blah blah blah, they wind up with a language. That's not what happens. Every language comes from some other language that was being spoken. And over time, that language began to drift from its center and to take on a new form as this community of language users, they all began to speak it in a very different sort of way. New vocabulary comes in, new pronunciation perhaps comes in, new grammatical structures come to play, and eventually it's drifted so far from where it started that it's no longer comprehensible to other speakers of that parent language, and it has become its own new language. This is how English, modern English developed from Middle English in this way. Middle English developed from a combination of Anglo-Saxon and Old French. Anglo-Saxon developed from a Proto-High-Germanic, and so on and so forth. French developed from earlier Romance languages that themselves developed from Latin. This is the standard way that every language comes about this way. Latin came about that way until you get back to some hypothetical first language that wasn't developed from another one. So because this is the case, language really happens, it really develops between two people who share a community and a culture who are speaking this language together with the goal of being understood, of making themselves understood to the other person. Language, all language that's natural, so not something made up, right, like Elvish, all natural language develops in the ear. People are speaking it and hearing it spoken long before they write it down, and it achieves its mature grammatical form before it comes to be written down. And so because that's the case, the best way to understand a language, and what I mean by understanding a language, is if you want to understand why it's the way it is. How did it develop? How does it continue to develop through time? And how does it think? How does it put the world together? The best way to do that is to follow your ear. This is very familiar to folks who have studied French, because French as a language is famous for having a very strange orthography relative to how it sounds when you pronounce it. There are really interesting and important historical reasons why that's the case, and if I were making a video about the history of the French language, we would get into those. We're not going to do that, but nevertheless, you're aware, if you've studied modern French, that the way the word looks on the page and the way it sounds when spoken by a French speaker may not be terribly similar. You might never be able to guess how to spell a French word if you're hearing it for the first time, because you just don't know what's going on with all these different letters and things. All of that is quite accidental. It didn't have to be that way. The language could sound exactly the way that it does now and have been written differently. And in fact, we see some of this in modern Romance languages and languages like French with the advent of texting. Teenagers aren't going to bother writing out all those silent consonants that you're not going to say, right? It's just too much work when you're typing something out. And so a lot of times what's developed is alternate spellings of words for texting, and we see this in English too. Things like love, L-U-V, instead of L-O-V-E. There is nothing wrong with L-U-V as a way of writing the word love. It's just not the way that we went historically. It's an alternate path. And the truth of the matter is these alternate paths survive for a long time, actually. Not only is spelling one of the last things to develop in a language, it's also the last aspect of a language to get fixed. Take some important text or some important court or something like that, a center that is of great cultural and typically even also political importance, to fix spelling, because then everyone wants to spell it the way that the king does, or everyone starts to spell it the way that Dante spelled it, or that King Alfred spelled it in his translations, or something like that. All of that stuff is very natural to language development. Now, the third category of things that are outside of grammar proper, but that are a real aspect of how a language works and how we use a language, is usage. And this is actually the least integrated part of a language. Usage describes a set of social norms that govern the use of language. Set of social norms that govern the use of language. They're completely external to grammar. And English has a lot of these, and I think a lot of these are, when people talk about grammatical errors and when they ask me about, what's this thing in grammar, most of the time they're asking me about a usage question and not a grammatical question. And I think that's really natural because as native speakers of English, they aren't struggling with the grammar. They're struggling with why do we do it this way rather than that way. So what are some of those things? And I think some of these are worth digging into a bit. The first one is ending a sentence with a preposition. You're not supposed to do it, right? This is a negative thing that is ruled out, and it is often described as a grammatical error, but in fact it's just a usage thing. English is a Germanic language, and Germanic languages have a class of verbs called prepositional object verbs, in which the preposition is part of the verb, and it's a part of the verb that doesn't require an object of its own. So, for example, in German, they have this verb, they have the verb kommen, which means to come, but they also have the verb mitkommen, which means to come with. And so it's very natural for me to say, kommst du mit? Are you coming with? And that is a grammatically correct and very natural expression in German. You cannot do that in Latin. Romance languages don't have this. But English is not a Romance language. English is a Germanic language, and we do have that. Now, the tension between Romance and Germanic is one we're going to have to return to in a minute, so keep that in mind. Another one of these is to avoid the use of the passive voice. This is a social construction. It's arbitrary, and it is deeply socially conditioned. It only dates from about the beginning of the 20th century, and the types of arguments made against the use of the passive voice, I think, are really enlightening. So I wanted to read a couple for you here. This one is from Arthur Quiller Couch's On the Art of Writing, published in 1916, when he says this: generally, use transitive verbs that strike their object, and use them in the active voice, eschewing the stationary passive with its little auxiliary itses and wases, and its participles getting into the light of your adjectives, which should be few. For as a rough law, by his use of the straight verb and by his economy of adjectives, you can tell a man's style, if it be masculine or neuter, writing or composition. Not the most exciting argument from the standpoint of an awareness of social constructs such as a weirdly constructed social masculinity, or preference for the masculine over the feminine, or even just anything that sounds like it has to do with language at all, right? None of that stuff had anything to do with language so much as Arthur Quiller Couch prefers vigorous prose, and he wants you to be writing in vigorous prose. Right. Well, vigorous prose is great, but it's not the only type of prose, and there might be reasons to use non-vigorous prose for a variety of literary effects. Here's another one. This is from just 2 years later. William Strunk Jr. wrote this in his Elements of Style. He says, the active voice is usually more direct and vigorous than the passive. This rule does not, of course, mean that the writer should entirely discard the passive voice, which is frequently convenient and sometimes necessary. The need to make a particular word the subject of the sentence will often determine which voice is to be used. The habitual use of the active voice, however, makes for forcible writing. This is true not only in narrative concerned principally with action, but in writing of any kind. Many a tame sentence of description or exposition can be made lively and emphatic by substituting a transitive in the active voice for some such perfunctory expression as there is or could be heard. Okay, I get it. William and Arthur, you guys prefer active voice sentences. That's fine. You write in the active voice. That's fine. But that's not a rule that all English writers should avoid the passive voice. It's not an argument. It's a preference. That's a great example of what usage is. It's not about what's necessary to the language. It's just about how we have agreed to act. The reason why you're supposed to avoid the passive voice is because we've all agreed not to write in the passive voice. That's it. Now, here's another one. The preference of others to self in pronouns, right? The fact that I meant to say, Bob and I ran into a lost dog rather than I and Bob. That sounds terrible, right? I and Bob. No, it's horribly wrong. Or the burglar chased Dan and me, not chased me and Dan. Those are just usage. There's nothing grammatically wrong with putting Bob or I first. They're both nominative. They both are subjects of the verb. Anyone could come first. It's simply down to usage. Split infinitives are one of these. The idea that you shouldn't put anything between the two and then the verb part of the infinitive. So, for example, you should say quickly to find the answer rather than to quickly find the answer. This is one of the things that I get. People correct me on this all the time. I like to split my infinitives. I think it's very nice to have the adverb closer to the actual verbal part. Quickly to find, it feels different to me than to quickly find. And I like to quickly find better. And people are always trying, editors are always marking this in my writing. Don't split your infinitives. And I just say, why not? Well, it's a grammatical error. No, it isn't. It isn't. It is, it's a usage thing. And it came about because in Latin, you can't do that, right? The infinitive is one word most of the time in Latin, and so you don't have anything between the infinitive and the modifier. You keep the infinitive in one place. But in English, the to is not part of the infinitive. It's a different relationship between the two halves of the word than what you would have in Latin. And so different rules ought to apply to it. Whether you think split infinitives are good or bad is not really the point. The point is, it's a usage question, not a grammatical one. Another one that we get a lot is avoid starting sentences with conjunctions. Again, there's no reason not to do that. Hebrew does it all the time. Most sentences in the Old Testament scriptures in the Hebrew Bible start with their conjunction and. Latin does it all the time. Greek does it all the time. Other languages still do. There's no reason, grammatically speaking, not to do it. It's just a usage thing. This one also, I have a hard time convincing people of this one. Not just that run-on sentences should be avoided is a usage thing, but the very category of a run-on sentence is a usage thing. It's not, there's no clear definition of what a run-on is. When a sentence passes over from being a beautiful Jane Austen-y thing to being a run-on. Oh, what if it doesn't have a conjunction? Yeah, we call that a syndeton. We have a Greek word to describe that rhetorical trick, which is widely used by the classical and medieval writers. Run-on sentences are not a bad thing. It's just that in the Victorian period in England, that's to say the 1870s to the 1900s, you began to see a preference for shorter sentences in response to the new modernist philosophy of utilitarianism and pragmatism and that sort of a thing. And so this starts to show up in manuals of style in the same way the passive voice does 20 years later. Right? Now, a lot of these things have something in common. Many of them, not the prepositions ending a sentence thing, but pretty much all the rest of them, they're rooted in attempts to make English more like Latin. And this project was one that was really largely initiated, popularized, and then prosecuted with strict intensity by John Dryden, the first poet laureate of England, who lived from 1631 to 1700. He writes this about his native tongue. The English language is not capable of such a sweetness and softness as the Italian, by which he really means Latin. It is too rough, and too much of the barbarous is in it. Well, that whole category of barbaric needs to be radically re-examined and probably jettisoned from most of the places where we use it, but never mind that for the moment. The important thing is he's diagnosing that his language is barbaric and needs to be moved in the direction of Latin in order to civilize it. And he felt that it was his duty as one of the guardians of language to help to refine and perfect the English language. He didn't just think this about the English language, by the way. He also went back to Shakespeare's plays, and he was like, yeah, the problem with Shakespeare's plays is there's all these irregularities in the meter and in the grammar, and they can be improved. And so he went back, he just had this whole method of analyzing plays where he would say, oh, Hamlet is, I won't say Hamlet, I'll say Troilus and Cressida, which is one of the ones I know he rewrote, is 70% regular. I'm going to rewrite it so that it's 100% regular. And he did. And I read it. When I was in college, I was doing my senior thesis on Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida, and I wanted to compare it to Shakespeare and Dryden. Originally, my thesis was going to be a comparison of all three, but when I read all three, I was like, Chaucer's is way better, I'm just going to do his. But comparing Shakespeare to Dryden, Shakespeare's play is way better. It turns out that 30% irregularity that Dryden was diagnosing in Shakespeare is where the poetry lies. That's where the genius of it lies. And he lost that by making it conform to a system that he devised that was arbitrary because it came from outside the logic of English. Remember I said English is not a Romance language, it's a Germanic language. And so we should be judged on Germanic principles, not on Romance principles. Listen, I love Latin, don't get me wrong, but I don't want English to be Latin. And I don't think that English is best when it's trying to be Latin. That's not, Latin is not so great that all other languages should bow to it or should turn into it. Okay, so what all this means is none of the errors that I've been talking about for the last several minutes, pronunciation, orthography, spelling, punctuation, and all these different usage errors, none of those are grammatical errors, right? Now, I'm not saying, if you're a teacher and you're marking papers, I'm not saying that you shouldn't take off points for any of these things, but crucially, I'm also not saying that you should. I'm saying that as you consider whether or not to take off points for these things, think about the fact that they have different levels of relationship to what it means to speak English well. Before the 20th century, the great English writers, Milton, Spenser, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Bunyan, Jane Austen, the list goes on and on and on, right? Mary Shelley. All these guys used the passive voice and didn't worry about it. It wasn't an issue for them. And there were no less excellent writers of English than our writers since the beginning of the 20th century have been. It doesn't belong to writing well in English to follow these usage rules, right? So I think there is value in teaching students to be ready for what they're going to encounter in the world, how they're going to be edited by others, and so on and so forth. I also think there's value in making distinctions between the types of errors that show that you're not understanding how English works and the types of errors that just say you're pushing back against the socially accepted norms for how we're going to speak English. Both are important. Someone who wants to sound fluent like a native speaker has to keep both in mind. But at the end of the day, they are different types of things. And for the purpose of understanding English from a grammatical standpoint, it is absolutely crucial that we learn to separate what belongs to morphology and syntax to what belongs to the other more accidental features of language. Thank you.